Hello, welcome. So I get your names down. Thank you for making it again this week as we're doing the Black Legend, right? With the Spaniards, there's a contention by at first by Whig English historians and the Whig Party, WHIG. They tried to contend that the English had a political tradition that was freer, that was more amenable to the rights of individuals and to the participation of more people in government, and that more autonomy and economic opportunities were available to the average person, and ought to be in England, and that England had a liberal advantage over Spain. That Spain had had a unique path to the early modern period, and that period was very autocratic, and that period was very religiously zealous and fanatical, and very inequitable. And right by inequitable, I mean like basically imbalanced and unfair regarding the rights of the individual. And so the Spaniards, under a guy named Julian, they wrote back, their jurist responded and said, this is all a black lie. This is all a black legend about us, that it's unfair, depicting us, the Spanish, as a convenient anti-model, right, for the modern era, of saying this is how you're not supposed to be, as were the Spanish with the Native Americans. So in doing that, I wanted to give you some context. I don't know how much time you've had thus far to look at the southern and the northern colonies. You could make the argument on number one this is from my US government, our US history class. The first one, right, talking about how there were burgeoning opportunities for more people in the New World than there were back in England from the get-go. Thanks to the joint stock companies and opportunities to come here as an indentured servant and work off your term, etc., and then receive land and your freedom dues at the end of that term. That's arguable. Then you have also, as context, Virginia from a native perspective, and you see how the Jamestown settlers were rather manipulative, rather ruthless, rather immoral in their dealings with the Native Americans, the Powhatan Confederacy in particular. So notice here, right, before that you perceive that you mean to plant among them, build a fort with an invulnerable facade. So before the Native Americans realize that you're going to be there as the Jamestown Company settlers for good, be sure that you could defend yourselves, because they're not going to take a liking to it. And so that's the ugly imperialist right there, right? The English coming in and saying, we know we're not going to be wanted by the Native Americans, but we don't care. We're going to take what's ours, and we're going to try to augment that, and even at the expense of the Native Americans. And it says here, right, take care of your own firstly, right? And so you see a darker side to the English colonists right off the bat with the Powhatan Confederacy, right? The famous Pocahontas's father and his confederacy. And then, of course, they have their defense of such on number three, if you wanted to look into that. But of course, it's from John Smith's account, and you got to keep that in mind. You got to consider the source. And then I get into slavery with the Southern colonies, the English Southern colonies, okay, that it was an economic decision. And so I somewhat paradoxically use Ibram Kendi. And Ibram Kendi is the spokesman for the new anti-racism movement. And he is very much, for the thesis that slavery, like stamped from the beginning, that those of African descent were stereotyped and discriminated from the beginning. But nevertheless, you find evidence in his book of economic motives, arguably underlying that. Now, that's a very subjective claim with the slave trade. And so then there's evidence against that. Look up a case of Antonio, the quote, Negro Johnson. Antonio Johnson, John Punch, and those are conceded in this segment as well. They were treated in discriminatory fashion because of the color of their skin, pure and simple, right off the beginning in the English colonies. So were the English any better, right? Were they hypocritical in their Whig claims of superiority to the Spanish? And then African-American agency in early California, early South Carolina. I'm not getting a direct correlation with the Black Legend on that, so I'm going to leave that one alone for now. And of course, number 6, of course, slave conditions were awful, right? So evidence for the misery of slaves under the English in the Southern colonies. All right. And same thing with number 7, that's with the French. And the same thing with number 8 is with the French. So now I'm going to move on to the Northern colonies, if you don't mind, just to give you some context, something to compare and contrast, right? When looking at the Black Legend. Let's see here, there they are. All right, so the Northern colonies, you see the New England colonies primarily, right? And then the middle colonies of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Let's see here, and New York. So number 1, you get good Whig history. The look for evidence of the English being kind of ahead of their time, being progressive amongst the bourgeois. And by the way, there are those who make a very strong dichotomy between the Northern colonies and the Southern colonies. And the narrative plays well up and kind of conveniently up into the Civil War, contending that like there's a guy named David Hackett Fisher, Fischer, and he has a book on this called, I think it's New Albion, but Albion was the old Greek word for England. But at any rate, in his book, he contends that more progressive bourgeois people from the city, from Bristol, Liverpool, and London, came and populated the Northern colonies, whereas the old school gentry class, Gentry, kind of dominated the South. And he makes that dichotomy, right, that the gentry class was more old-fashioned, more oligarchical, more inequitable. They were accustomed to people deferring to them as their betters, having servants work on their land, having slaves, etc. So there's a dichotomy that some historians make with the Northern and Southern colonies, as you see in number 1 here, and saying that those bourgeois people who came into Massachusetts, in particular Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were for literacy, public schools, they were for the democratic election of their pastors, they were for science. But then again, you have the Salem witch trials, right? And you have other things to go against that with number 1. And so then number 2, I take a 180 and I show evidence of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in particular of the Puritans, being very exclusivist, being very undemocratic, for lack of a better adjective, and kind of hierarchical themselves, for being very intolerant, and especially toward the Native Americans. And they could be very ruthless toward the Narragansett, even the Wampanoag that the Pilgrims had made a treaty of equality with. Eventually, they fought in King Philip's War, and that was a nasty war. And so the Puritans and the Pilgrims, they could fight viciously against Native Americans. They could be very exclusivist in who could govern and rule, who had opportunities. They definitely had a hierarchy as far as socioeconomics, as far as land ownership and power, etc. And so you find evidence of that in number 2 here, right? So again, you're wondering, were the English any better, right, in the early modern period of like the 1600s compared to the Spanish? Because the Spanish, right, that's the heart of the Black Legend, is that the Spanish were, they were anomalously bad. They were out of the ordinary. They were especially bad as colonizers, right? So number 2 is interesting. This is on the Salem witch trials. It's not argumentatively organized. It's just more factual. Uh-oh, there's supposed to be more beyond this, and I don't know what's wrong. But I'm going to go on to the Black Legend now, okay? But hopefully that doesn't happen on the copy that I gave you to read. All right, so moving on to the Black Legend. Come on. The first couple are intended to defend the Spanish. What is going on? Now the print is not showing up here either. All right, now I'm going to have to go off of memory. I tell you what, if it can go wrong for me, it will. Hopefully they'll please let me know, okay, by way of Canvas message, if your copy looks like this. It should look fine. Just before the Zoom meeting, I took a look at all of these and they look just fine. Okay, but with number one, right, I'm defending Christopher Columbus. I contend, right, that it was the system, that you should hate the system more than you should blame the individual Spaniards for how ruthless they were with the Native Americans. So when you look back at Europe, you have Reorient is an interesting book whereby Andre Gunder Frank, the author, he focuses upon European interest in the Orient in Asia, and particularly India, China, and Cipangu, or Japan, and Indonesia. And there was great covetousness for their goods, right, for these Asian goods. And so Europe, by way of the Italian city-states in particular, really got their hands wet in this endeavor in the 1500s. And so when they did, it was rather a ruthless system that kind of evolved, right? Whereby the merchants and other men of money of this new kind of bourgeois class that was developing, they would open up their business and they would offer people an opportunity to work for them, but they would say, what do you have in store for me? I'm going to try this one more time. I'm going to stop this. I'm going to try at least one more time to go back to it. Whereby they would ask people, right? What if I were to, shoot.
Hey, Professor, can you hear me?
That's very unfortunate. All right. So at any rate, they would ask them, what do you have in store for me? Why should I hire you to work for my merchant company, right? And the argument contends on number one is the best answer, the most advantageous answer to get yourself out of your socioeconomic condition to improve your lot economically, right, and socially, was to tell them, I'll be a team player. I'll do whatever you want. And so they'd say, okay, go and take the Moluccas Islands, the Spice Islands from the Dutch. If you could do that by any means necessary, we will reward you handsomely. Or go to Sierra Leone and take 100 slaves and bring them back to Genoa or somewhere back in Italy. And so that's the kind of game that Christopher Columbus played. He had this opportunity to become a yes man, so to speak, and to do what his patrons, those who are paying for everything, for the ventures, to employ him. So he traded in slaves. He fought and almost died several times in battle for different islands in the quote Orient. And he got accustomed to this ruthless game before he went to Ferdinand and Isabella of Aragon and Castile, Spain, and got permission to be funded to try to go to the quote Orient by way of a westward passage. And we know what happens there. He goes to the Caribbean. And when he lands in the Caribbean, right, he makes a deal with the Arawak, tries to keep peace with the Taino. And with the Arawak, there was a misunderstanding over allegedly the raping of Native American women. And so his own allies became his enemies over this Fort Navidad incident of raping of women, and the soldiers were killed at that fort. And so then he had a very vindictive side, and so he arrested and had murdered the cacique, the chief of the Arawak, and thereafter was at war with the Arawak. Some of his men left off because, remember, you're inviting a renegade type demographic when you said, hey, go overseas with us. As long as we conquer and we capture whatever we're ordered to do, we will be rewarded handsomely for it. You're going to get a certain demographic of people, right? Of young unmarried men who have perhaps a soldierly, a martial background, and might not be the most upstanding citizens of your country. And so he had men, Spaniards, who went off on their own against his command to Puerto Rico and other islands and made enemies of the Taino. And before long, he was at war with the Taino. And his very alliance with the Arawak was against the Caribs that the Caribbean was named after. And so before you know it, it didn't take long, less than a year, and he was at war with all three of the major tribes of the Caribbean. And he had people publicly executed, some of his own men who engaged in treasonous activities because they kind of felt like, well, while the mouse is, while the cat's away, the mice will play sort of, scenario. And so he had some of his men publicly executed before the others. And before you know it, he was removed from his position of adelantado, of someone going forward and claiming pagan lands, and kind of a governor type position. He was had that stripped from him, and other titles like the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, etc., and was brought back in chains back to Spain. And so that thus begins the Black Legend, right? The stories of the Spaniards being especially ruthless with the Native Americans. You have a guy named Las Casas, right? Bartolome de Las Casas. And he became known as the defender of the Indios, of the Native Americans. And he wrote and said, right, in his writings, that the Spanish came like wolves, like tigers, looking for whom they could devour. And especially when they felt like they were safely 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, that they could do as they pleased. But again, right, this system of rewarding that type of behavior came from the top. It came from the Pope, Alexander VI, and his Alexandrian papal bulls, whereby he gave blessings to the Spaniards and the Portuguese to conquer the Americas, provided that they convert the Native Americans to the Holy Catholic Church and to the Christian faith. But he didn't say how they had to do it, right? The manner by which it was done. And that was left by virtue of the patronato, Patronato, patronage over the church was given to the Spanish crown, primarily to Isabella. And Isabella of Castile, right? She was the one that gave her blessing to the Spanish Inquisition. And so she was very religiously zealous. And she even tried to take over Muslim North Africa. And she forced those within Spain to convert to the Catholic Church and to the Christian faith, or to be expelled from Spain. So that's the type of leader you're dealing with. And so, in some cases, in some severe cases in Mexico, as well as in New Mexico and in Arizona, present day, Spaniards came in and they ordered a requerimiento, the requirement. And the requerimiento, they would basically cite the Nicene Creed and say that you have 24 hours to convert to the Nicene Creed and to the Catholic Church, or else we declare holy war on you. And so that was pretty a severe method, needless to say, to use against the natives. And if you wanted to really adhere to the Black Legend, like I said, I mean, you look at evidence like with the exploitative practices, right? The encomienda. If you went and conquered a Native American or area of Native Americans, you were entitled to their forced labor, provided that you have them convert by one way or another, one manner or another. And so the encomienda was rather exploitative. And when I believe it was Carlos I of Spain, known as Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, he put an end to the encomienda system, and the viceroy was killed, was murdered in South America over it, trying to enforce it. The Spaniards tried to hold on to that encomienda system so well, because this is a nouveau riche demographic. This is a demographic of hidalgos, of men who were not noble, but came and fought, and by virtue of their victory on the battlefield, were granted minor noble status and titles and forced labor and other types of privileges and powers that they had never known before. But again, right, this system is rewarding that type of behavior that the Europeans were doing, particularly the Spanish. And so you have that to contend with. And then they formed a rather hierarchical society by today's standards, as you see on number 3, as we could see normally on number 3. And that is, the argument was, right, is the conquistadores, the conquerors, they conquered the Native Americans, right? This new demographic of nouveau riche men, Spaniards, but they themselves were conquered by the crown subsequently, because they didn't trust them with that much power and those many, those privileges, etc. So the royal crown took over, and they formed they formed these empires, if you will. There were about 4 of them, and kind of like a secular form of a bishopric with the church. These districts, right, that would be put under a viceroy, a virrey. And the viceroy was like the king or queen in his or her absence. They had total enforcement of all the laws of Castile over the Americas. They had the power of life and death over those who have been convicted by a judge. They had a lot of power. They carried the royal scepter with them. They were carried. They were not even to walk on the ground under certain ceremonial instances. It was good to be viceroy. And then they handpicked governors. And then beneath the governors, you had the corregidores, like where you get the term corregir, or to correct in Spanish. And the corregidores came to the towns, and they could overturn the city council decisions, these corregidores. They also were to enforce tribute, whatever tribute you as a Native American environment, society had to pay to the crown. Oftentimes it was at least the royal 1/5 of all goods, the royal quinto. But it was more than that. Usually there were sales taxes and other things to be collected. So the corregidores were hated intruders of Spaniards who came into the cities and could kind of exact their will over the city governments. And then you also had kind of a racial caste system, in that almost everyone who was a corregidor, almost everyone who was a governor, virtually every viceroy was a Spaniard from the Iberian Peninsula, known as a peninsular. So the peninsulares had a monopoly, a near monopoly on the top positions in Spanish America. And then beneath them, you had and you also had judges who were handpicked, known as oidores, like to oír, to listen to the cases on a case-by-case basis. And they were nearly all peninsulares, well-educated, well-connected back to the royal council back in Spain itself. And so, at any rate, then beneath them, you had the criollos, or the creoles. And the creoles were of pure Spanish blood, supposedly pure Spanish blood. Let me put that in quotes, because we've talked about the ethnically diverse history of Spain, right, last week. And so at any rate, they had a Spanish mother and a Spanish father, but they were born in the Americas. So a lot of them rose up through the military and had high positions therein, and also in the church. Those were kind of their main avenues. But they had positions oftentimes on the city councils, the cabildos, and some of them became governors, etc. And then the majority of citizens didn't have an opportunity for any of those main positions, and they were known as mestizos. And mestizos, right, were an indigenous mom most of the time and a Spanish father, because a lot of the Spaniards came without their wives or were young single soldiers. And so they found their camaraderie and their marriage partner in a Native American woman. And so a lot of the majority of inhabitants of the Spanish Americas were mestizo, and they never knew the opportunity to be a judge, a governor, a corregidor, much less a viceroy, or even sit on the city cabildo. And so you had that kind of system set up, especially in the well-populated, highly urbanized areas in Mexico and Peru and other areas of Central and South America. And so, yeah, so you had this kind of hierarchy. Then also with their economic system, they had a system whereby in Mexico, for instance, only Acapulco and Veracruz were open to trade officially. You had to have the right papers to trade in the right goods. So the big money makers like slavery, sugar, cocoa, textiles, etc., you had to be well connected to have the proper papers to trade in those goods. So those economic opportunities were widely kind of monopolized by the Spaniards on the top. Oftentimes they contended that you could eat the crumbs from the table if you engaged in local trade, just with your local area. You could be a mestizo, you could be an indigenous Native American, etc., and trade at like a local equivalent to like a flea market, a local mercado. But that was about it. And so the argument is, right, is that Spain especially had a very inequitable, hierarchical, quote, backward society over the Native Americans, right? Whereas you had more opportunities for the common person in English America. And that's argumentative. I would argue that you can pick and choose areas, right? That make exceptions to that general rule. Or at least that stereotype of Whig history. So for instance, California, look at the first cabildos of California, Los Angeles, for instance. You had mestizos serve on the city council. You had hated corregidores come into the pueblo of San Jose, California, and were chased out for fear of their lives. And with the city council telling them, we will do what we want to do here in San Jose, and we're not going to answer to an outside royal official who tries to tell us otherwise. So in California, you had more fluidity, you had more opportunities for different demographics and different people, evidently. For one, because it was La Frontera, it was the frontier. It was safely over 1,800 miles from Mexico City in the Viceroy. And so California was more fluid than the general rule that I'm explaining, that I've been explaining the last 10 minutes. I would make the argument, if you wanted to support the Black legend, I might arguably point to in areas of the US, as far as Mexican-American history, this being the class, I would probably arguably subjectively choose New Mexico. New Mexico was very contested. It was very oligarchic. You look at a guy named Oñate, O-N with the Nye thing over it, A-T-E, Don Juan de Oñate. He was removed for abuse of power and nepotism and intertwining his private money with public funds, etc. But he was removed for power over it. You also have the Santa Fe Rebellion of 1680. A good book on this is When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away, by a guy named Gutierrez. It's very conflict laden, the book. A lot of power imposed upon the people of New Mexico by the Spanish view, and then rebellion that came from that, whereby they were a bit too tyrannical. And so again, if I were to look at, if I wanted to depict the Spanish as being inequitable, inequitable, tyrannical, I would choose in present day Los Estados Unidos territory, I would choose New Mexico, to be honest. from the books that I've read. But I certainly would not choose California. Again, there was a lot of fluidity for people of indigenous blood. They called it mulatto blood at that time, and we don't use that term anymore, but black and white blood, biracial. More opportunities for demographics like that in California, in Alta or Upper California, as opposed to Baja. And so, yeah, so that's something to look into. And then also with the, then you have a section that I wish we could see on the missions. And the missions were basically depicted in that, on that number, as a mixed bag, right? You have court history, and Spanish court history praises the benevolent friars and priests of the 21 missions of California, and contends that they were well-meaning, they were self-sacrificing, they were altruistic, putting the needs of the natives above their own. They endured many privations and isolation and so forth. And they all did it for the glory of God and the glory of Spain, etc. Right? And you see that in the hagiographies. That's a biography that tries to make a saint out of some of these friars. So of course you have most famously Junipero Serra in California. And in very controversial fashion, Pope Francis has just made a saint out of Junipero Serra. And there were people who came to Carmel and protested that, right? Native American spokesmen and others who contended that he should not be rewarded with sainthood. Because for one thing, right, is they encourage the Native Americans to commit cultural genocide, to kill their own culture, to assimilate to all things Spanish. They were taught modern at that time trades like blacksmiths and tanners and ranchers and farmers, etc., after the Spanish fashion of doing things. And of course, the Spaniards contended that that was for their own good, to try to get them up to speed with modern economic changes. But some people contend that the Spanish friars ran their missions like a sweatshop, right, with the Native Americans as virtual slaves, having to work, having 1 hour after another throughout a given week, a given day, dictated to them as to what and how they did things. And so a controversial figure to me would be Narciso Duran in the San Jose mission. People came and visited and contended that he was running it like a sweatshop, making it a very profitable enterprise for himself and for the Spaniards, at the expense of the exploitation and labor of who they called neophytes, the Native Americans who had converted to Christianity and joined the missions. And you got to remember, they chose the missions. They were not forced into the missions on almost all cases that I could find in my studies. But of course, they were coaxed with goods and foods and other types of things. They tried to entice them onto the missions. And once they were there, right, they couldn't leave without permission. And so you have Van Kotzebue, a priest who came to one of the California missions, or a number of them actually, and contended that he thought the missions were run as coercive institutions. And that leads to conflict history or Marxist history of the missions, right? And that does a whole 180 with the Spanish court history of praising the Spaniards. It makes villains of the Spaniards and contends that they were exploitative imperialists, that they were ethnocentric and arrogantly putting their own culture and their own way of doing things as the center of the universe, and forced the Native Americans to commit cultural genocide with their own ways, etc., and own practices. And so you have an element of conflict history that is conceded in number 4 as well, right? And then, of course, you had inadvertent damage, damage that wasn't intended but happened nevertheless. And the primary occasion for that, or primary instance that's cited in the books, like Children of Coyote book, is that disease, right? The Spaniards inadvertently brought diseases and the Native Americans died in droves when certain epidemics arose. There was an epidemic in 1795 in the San Francisco Mission, and over half the native neophytes died from it, contracted it. I want to say it was smallpox, but don't quote me for sure. So at any rate, right, so hence on number 4, I kind of took a middle of the road stance and said that the missions were a mixed bag, that there was an element of truth to both historiographical interpretations, that there was a little bit of almost heroism of the Spanish friars like Junipero Serra in trying to protect the Native Americans from the presidios, from the soldiers of the nearby forts, from the inhabitants of the pueblos, of the cities, from the hacendados who had the haciendas and wanted to exploit the Native Americans. You find evidence of them trying to protect them. Again, evidence of privation, evidence of martyrdom amongst the Spanish friars and self-sacrifice. But then again, you also have evidence of exploitation, of coercion, of them being forced to stay on the missions. Very begrudgingly, they were allowed just 2 weeks a year on average to leave the mission. And if they didn't come back, they sent soldiers looking for them down into the Central Valley in particular to try to force them to come back, because the assumption is they will forsake their Catholic practices and beliefs if they stay off the mission, and their souls will be lost for eternity. And so hence you must force them to come back to the missions. So the conflict history, there's evidence for that as well, of exploitation, of coercion, of cultural genocide, etc. Right? And then lastly, I contend I do good old deflection as I point to English Virginia and say, were the English any better? First of all, we've gone over how they dealt with Native Americans, the Powhatan Wars, if you wanted to look those up. If you wanted to look up the Pequot War, P-E-Q-U-O-T, with the Puritans. If you wanted to look up King Philip's War with the Pilgrims, they could be just as ruthless with Native Americans as the Spanish could. And of course, with the Spanish, I think of evidence of the Navajo and other Pueblo tribes in New Mexico. A lot of conflict, power plays, rebellions, etc. You had a San Diego rebellion at the mission around 1775. And you have evidence of rebellions in Spanish Florida that I didn't even get into. And then you had the Pima and Yuma rebellions in Arizona. And so you have a lot of conflict history between the Euro colonizers and the Native Americans, but you find it amongst the English, the Dutch in New York, as well as the Spanish, right, in these different regions. And then also the fact that how inequitable English Virginia was. The gentry class held the lion's share of political offices, of the best, most fertile land. They dictated culture. So hence they were politically, economically, and socially, the fancy word is hegemonic, dominant, right? And so were the English any better? And of course, I thought I would end with that one. And so any questions or comments so far on the Black Legend and understanding what I'm trying to convey, what I'd like you to think about and look into? Because remember, you're looking at the accusation, were the Spanish anomalously out of the ordinary? Were they a very convenient modern anti-model for today? How not to be today?
No, I have no questions.
Professor, can you hear us?
Miguel, go ahead and make sure that you are unmuted, okay, Miguel? I see your mouth moving, but I can't hear you.
I'm unmuted, but I don't think your audio is connected to the Zoom. So I think it's
no problem.
Yeah.
And if you can't, Miguel, keep trying. But if you cannot, why don't you go ahead and chat? Go to the chat here and type something out for me, okay? And of course, if you could share your screen, if you know how to do that, by all means, please do so. So yeah, the New Mexico was colonized in the 1590s by the Spanish. Texas was fought for largely in the 17 teens when the French tried to take it under Saint Denis. The Pimeria Alta, or Arizona, was begun in the 1620s and then in earnest again in the 1680s. Florida, oh gosh, I'm not well versed on Florida. It's been a while since I've read a book on Spanish Florida. I may need to get back to you on that. I'll have an opportunity when we do the War of 1812 and the wars with the Seminoles. So I'll try to brush up on that. And then of course, California, the 1780s is when you have the Camino Real with the 21 missions, to give you a little bit of chronological context. But any typed questions or comments?
No, I have no questions.
And I'll tell you what I'll do also is between this week and next week, I'm going to look into the properties on my Zoom to make sure that I do everything that I can on my part to ensure that you could unmute yourselves and participate in the Zoom meeting. That's the heart of this meeting. I didn't intend to solely lecture. So which are the thesis sections? All right. So remember, each number with a title is a thesis section. Okay. So I have 5 of them on this one. So yeah, each of those 5 has its own unique thesis that it's trying to convey. So please read all 5, but just choose any one of those 5. And remember, you're analyzing. You're picking apart what the section's main argument is. Give me an example of how it's being supported, that argument, and then personally evaluate it. How fair, how balanced, etc. do you think it is? Okay, on any of the numbers 1 through 5. So an example is just like what I mentioned, right? Of citing a thesis is just regurgitate it for me in your own words, right? So in number 1, you could contend, if you should choose that one, that the writer is trying to excuse the ruthless behavior of Spanish conquistadores like Columbus, although he was a Genoese, he was Italian, you get the point. Trying to convey the fact that it was the system that rewarded and demanded ruthlessness rather than the people themselves. That being an example of citing the thesis for number 1, right? I'm trying to go by memory since I can't see anything here, darn it. Like I said, number 4 that we just talked about with the missions. The author contends that there is merit to both Spanish court history and conflict history concerning the Spanish missions. Goes on to say that that there is evidence for, making heroes, if I don't know if I'd go that far, but heroes of the Spanish friars, etc., but also vilifying them, right? And contending that the missions were exploitative and coercive, etc. So that'd be an example of citing number 4's thesis. Just in a sentence or two, you could do it. And then give me an example or two of how it's being defended. Disabled, that is very disheartening. Okay, I'm hoping that that will be rectified by next week. Okay, I'll try to get behind this and see what I can do, what I need to do to change that. Because I certainly want you to be able to share your screen, and I certainly want you to be able to unmute yourselves. All right, so I'm very sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, but do you guys feel relatively better about this assignment, having sat through this?
Yeah, I feel okay. How do you feel, Jasmine?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll fix this, okay? I'll get whatever help I need, and we'll fix this by next week. So I could speak with you. You could speak with me. Very, very lamentable that we can't do that yet. All right, and so that's it for me, okay? I hope that I was of some help, of some assistance in doing this assignment for you. And my apologies again over the grading. All right, I'll get on that very soon. Okay. The problem is I'm new to this class, so I'm just a week or two ahead of you guys in marshaling all the data on these subjects and then getting it out on these assignments. And I have 2 other jobs. It's no excuse, but I will get to the grading very soon, so you can get a better feel for how you're doing in meeting my subjective requirements. Okay. But again, you'll get extra credit for this assignment for being here today. I greatly appreciate you being here and fully hope and anticipate you guys to be here again next week. All right. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to go ahead and bid you adieu. Okay. All right. Thank you. Nice to see you. Bye, Jasmine, as well.